The factory floor was unusually quiet that morning. Rows of workers stood near their stations, whispering in low voices, their eyes fixed on the giant crates being lowered from the trucks. The crates were heavy, made of dark wood, with large stickers written in a foreign language. No one could read those words, but everyone knew what the crates carried inside, machines that were said to be the most advanced in the world. The company had spent millions to import them. These machines were supposed to take production to the next level. They were powerful, fast, and could do the work of hundreds of men. Everyone expected that once the machines started running, the factory would never be the same again. The engineers, dressed neatly in their uniforms, waited with excitement. There were more than 100 of them, men and women who had studied for years, trained in the best institutions, and worked on complicated projects before. They were confident. After all, what could be so difficult for them? The crates were opened, and the machines were revealed. They were tall, silver-colored, with hundreds of wires and shining panels. Lights blinked faintly, like eyes waking up from a long sleep. The engineers moved closer, some scribbling notes, others checking the manuals that came with the shipment. "Look at this design," one engineer whispered. "It's nothing like what we've seen before." Another nodded, flipping through the thick instruction booklet. "It's advanced, yes. But we can manage. It's just a machine." The workers, standing at a distance, looked at the engineers with hope. For them, these machines meant security. If the machines worked, the factory would continue running, and jobs would be safe. If not, no one dared to finish that thought. Among the crowd was a janitor named Samuel. He wore a plain uniform, faded blue overalls with a company logo stitched on the chest. His hands were rough from years of cleaning floors, carrying tools, and fixing small things no one else cared about. His skin was dark, and his hair was turning gray at the sides. Most people barely noticed him. To the engineers, he was invisible, just another man pushing a broom. Samuel, however, had curious eyes. As the crates opened, he stopped sweeping for a moment and looked at the machines. He tilted his head, studying the wires, the gears, the control boards. Something about the design caught his attention. He didn't say a word. After all, who would listen to a janitor when so many engineers were standing there with their degrees and titles? The factory manager arrived soon after. He was a tall man with sharp glasses, carrying an air of authority. "These machines," he said proudly, "will change everything for us. But remember, they are complicated. We must handle them carefully. Our engineers will take full charge. No one else should interfere." The engineers nodded. The workers clapped politely. Samuel went back to sweeping, though his eyes kept returning to the shining machines. By noon, the first machine was connected to the power supply. Wires were fixed, buttons pressed, and switches turned. Everyone waited as the engineers worked with confidence. The factory floor buzzed with excitement. But when the start button was pressed, nothing happened. A strange silence filled the room. The engineers frowned, checked the wires again, and pressed the button once more. Still nothing. Some lights blinked weakly, but the machine refused to move. "It must be a wiring issue," one engineer said quickly. "We'll fix it." For the rest of the day, the engineers tried again and again. They read the manuals, changed the connections, and even replaced some parts. But no matter what they did, the machine remained still, like a sleeping giant unwilling to wake. The workers started whispering. The excitement that had filled the room in the morning slowly turned into doubt. "Maybe the machine is broken," someone said. "Maybe it can't work here." Samuel listened quietly while sweeping near the back wall. His sharp eyes caught details that others seemed to miss. A loose wire here, a misaligned lever there. He wanted to say something, but he didn't. He knew his place. People would laugh at the thought of a janitor teaching engineers. As evening came, the factory manager's face grew tense. "Tomorrow," he announced, "we will continue. The machine must work. We cannot afford failure." The engineers nodded, but their shoulders were heavy with frustration. The workers left with worried faces, wondering what the future would hold. Only Samuel stayed behind for a few minutes after everyone was gone. He walked slowly toward the silent machine. He placed his broom aside and touched the cold metal with his rough hand. His eyes studied the control panel once more, and a small smile appeared on his face. He whispered to himself, "It's not broken. It just needs someone to listen." Then he picked up his broom and left the hall quietly, his steps echoing in the empty factory. That night, the entire factory slept with questions in their hearts. Could the engineers fix the machine? Or had the company wasted its fortune? None of them knew that the answer was much closer than they imagined, standing silently among them, broom in hand. The next morning, the factory was alive again. The sound of footsteps echoed on the floor as engineers filled the hall, carrying their notebooks, tools, and laptops. Workers gathered at a distance, whispering with hopeful eyes. The machine, standing tall and silent, seemed to mock them all with its cold silence. The manager arrived early, his face stern but expectant. "Today," he declared, "we will succeed. Yesterday was only the beginning. Our engineers are the best. They will solve this." The words sounded confident, but deep inside, even he carried a quiet fear. The company had spent a fortune on these machines. The directors had high expectations. Failure was not an option. The engineers spread out around the machine. Some examined the control panel, while others checked the wires and switches again. One group studied the manual, flipping through pages filled with diagrams and foreign words. Another team worked on connecting the machine to different power sources. Hours passed. The air grew heavy. Sweat appeared on foreheads, and tools clattered against the floor. Every few minutes, someone would announce an idea, and the others would rush to test it. Each time, the button was pressed with hope. And each time, the result was the same: silence. The workers watching from the corners exchanged worried glances. "So many engineers," one whispered, "yet not one can make it work." "Maybe the machine doesn't belong here," another muttered. "It's foreign. Perhaps it cannot run on our systems." But the manager silenced them with a wave of his hand. "Be patient. They will succeed." Samuel, the janitor, had returned to his usual work. He moved quietly along the floor, sweeping dust, picking up screws, arranging tools left behind. No one paid attention to him, but his eyes never stopped studying the engineers. He watched the wires they connected, the buttons they pressed, the parts they replaced. He noticed small things they missed. A switch that was turned the wrong way. A lever that didn't sit firmly in place. He wanted to speak, but every time he opened his mouth, the voices of the engineers rose above him, confident and certain. So he remained silent, whispering only to himself. By afternoon, frustration began to spread. The lead engineer rubbed his temples, muttering, "Why won't it respond? Everything is correct." Another shook his head. "Maybe the manuals are wrong. Or maybe the machine was damaged during transport." The manager's patience began to crack. He removed his glasses and wiped them slowly, his eyes fixed on the engineers. "You were brought here for your skills," he said firmly. "Do not tell me a machine can defeat you." The hall grew tense. No one dared to reply. The engineers returned to work with renewed effort, but their hands trembled with pressure. Mistakes began to happen: wires burned out, tools dropped, and even small arguments broke out between them. As evening approached, the machine remained silent, its metal frame shining under the factory lights. It stood like a stubborn giant, unmoved by the endless attempts of 100 skilled minds. The workers shook their heads as they prepared to leave. Their voices were low, filled with disappointment. "If even the engineers cannot do it," one said softly, "then who can?" Samuel lingered near the back wall, holding his broom. His eyes rested on the machine, not with fear, but with quiet understanding. He could almost hear its language in his mind, a rhythm hidden in the gears, a pattern in the wires. To him, it was not a monster. It was simply a puzzle waiting to be solved. But no one asked for his thoughts. No one even looked in his direction. To them, he was only a man who cleaned the floor. The manager walked toward the engineers, his voice heavy. "Tomorrow," he said, "we try again. We will not admit defeat." "Not yet." The engineers nodded, though their shoulders were heavy and their eyes dim. They packed their tools in silence, avoiding each other's gaze. As the hall emptied, Samuel remained for a while. He walked slowly toward the machine, his broom tapping against the floor. He touched the cold metal once more, tracing the edges of the control panel with his rough fingers. He bent down and looked closely at a small connection near the base, where a wire seemed misplaced. He whispered again, "You're not broken. You're only waiting for the right hands." Then he stood up, took his broom, and walked away. That night, in the engineers' houses, there was no peace. Many of them stayed awake, thinking about the silent machine. Some revised their notes again and again. Others blamed themselves. A few even doubted their own abilities for the first time. The factory workers, on the other hand, worried about their future. If the machine never worked, the factory might shut down. Families would suffer. Children would go hungry. All their hopes now rested on the same engineers who had already failed twice. But in a small room on the edge of the workers' quarters, Samuel sat by his window. He looked at the stars and thought about the machine. He remembered the years he had spent fixing radios, bicycles, and broken fans for neighbors when he was younger. His hands had always been good with tools, but life had placed a broom in them instead. He smiled faintly and whispered to himself, "Sometimes the world forgets what a simple hand can do." And with that thought, he closed his eyes, already knowing that tomorrow would bring another day of failure for the engineers until the moment came when he could no longer stay silent. The third morning came with heavy clouds in the sky, as if nature itself carried the same weight as the factory. Inside the hall, the atmosphere was tense. The engineers gathered again, their faces tired from long hours of failure. The workers stood in the corners, whispering quietly, their hopes shrinking with every passing day. The machine still stood tall in the middle of the hall. Its metal body reflected the dull light above, and its silent frame seemed almost alive, as though it enjoyed watching the people around it struggle. The manager arrived, walking quickly with sharp steps. His eyes scanned the engineers. "This is the third day," he said firmly. "I want results today. We cannot keep wasting time. If you fail again, the consequences will be serious." His words were heavy, and everyone understood what they meant. The engineers exchanged nervous glances. Some adjusted their glasses, others tightened their grip on their notebooks. They had never faced such humiliation before. They were trained professionals, and yet a lifeless machine was defeating them. They began their work again, checking, testing, pulling wires, reading manuals. The sound of tools filled the hall, but the air carried no excitement now. It carried only stress. Samuel entered quietly with his broom. He moved along the floor, sweeping dust, cleaning corners, and arranging tools. Like always, no one noticed him. To them, he was part of the background like a wall, or a chair. But Samuel's eyes were sharp. As he swept near the machine, he listened to the engineers' conversations. Words like voltage, circuit, and programming filled the air. To most workers, those words were confusing. But Samuel understood more than anyone guessed. Years ago, before he became a janitor, Samuel had been a curious boy who loved machines. He grew up in a small town where money was scarce, but his hands were never idle. He fixed bicycles for neighbors, repaired radios for families, and even built small toys for children using broken parts. His father used to say, "Samuel, you see what others cannot see. You hear the voice of the machine." But life was not kind. Samuel never had the chance to study in big schools or earn shining certificates like the engineers around him. He had to work to support his family. One small job led to another, and eventually he became a janitor in the factory. Still, his love for machines never died. Whenever he cleaned the workshop, he studied the broken tools and machines left on the tables. Sometimes he secretly fixed them, leaving them working perfectly the next morning. People never knew it was him. They thought it was just luck. Now, as he stood near the foreign machine, Samuel's heart beat faster. He could see the mistake the engineers were making. He noticed how a certain wire was being connected wrongly, how a small lever was being ignored. To him, it was as clear as daylight. But his lips stayed closed. What could a janitor say among 100 engineers? Later in the day, as frustration grew, one of the engineers dropped his wrench angrily. It rolled across the floor and stopped near Samuel's feet. Samuel bent down, picked it up, and quietly returned it. The engineer took it without even looking at him. "Thank you," the engineer said quickly, his eyes still on the machine. Samuel nodded, but his eyes lingered on the panel for a second longer. He wanted to whisper, "Check that lower connection." But he swallowed his words and went back to sweeping. The day dragged on with no success. The engineers argued among themselves. One said, "The machine is too advanced for our systems." Another replied, "No, we are missing something simple." Their voices grew louder, but the silence of the machine drowned them all. The workers shook their heads and whispered, "It's hopeless." By evening, the manager's anger could no longer be hidden. He slammed his hand on the table. 3 days. 100 engineers, and not one solution. Do you call yourselves experts? At this rate, we will become the laughing stock of the entire industry. No one replied. The engineers lowered their heads in shame. As the hall emptied, Samuel stayed behind as usual. He leaned on his broom, staring at the machine with calm eyes. He stepped closer and placed his hand on the side panel. The cold metal seemed to speak to him. He whispered softly, "They don't see you. But I do." He bent down and adjusted a small screw with his fingers, then quickly pulled his hand back as footsteps echoed behind him. It was the night guard. Samuel smiled, picked up his broom, and walked away. That night, as the engineers struggled with doubt and the manager prepared angry reports for the directors, Samuel sat alone in his small room. He took out an old notebook filled with sketches of machines he had drawn in his younger days. Turning the pages slowly, he whispered, maybe tomorrow they will listen." For now, he remained the man no one noticed. The invisible figure sweeping floors while great minds failed. But the day was coming when the world would see him for who he truly was. The fourth morning began with a heavy silence in the factory. The workers stood quietly in the corners, their faces tired and filled with doubt. The engineers gathered around the machine once more, their notebooks under their arms, their eyes red from sleepless nights. The factory manager entered with a frown that seemed deeper than ever before. He looked at the silent machine, then at the 100 engineers who had promised success but delivered nothing. His voice was sharp. 4 days, he said. 4 days and still no progress. The directors are asking questions. If this continues, we will lose everything. You must fix this machine today. The engineers nodded nervously. They spread out again, opening panels, testing circuits, replacing wires. Tools clattered, manuals flipped, and voices rose in frustration. Yet the machine stood silent, unmoved, as if it enjoyed their failure. Samuel entered quietly with his broom. He swept the floor near the back wall, but his eyes never left the machine. His heart was heavy. For 3 days he had watched the engineers make the same mistakes. He had seen their wires connected in the wrong sequence, seen their focus on the wrong switches, seen them ignore the small lever near the base. To him, it was clear. To them, it was invisible. Every time he thought of speaking, his courage failed. He was only a janitor. What would people say if he stepped forward? They would laugh, maybe even scold him. Yet deep inside, he knew he could make the machine run. By afternoon, the engineer's frustration grew louder. Arguments broke out. "You're reading the manual wrong," shouted one. "No, you're connecting the wrong line," argued another. The manager slammed his hand on the table. "Enough. I don't want excuses. I want results." The workers whispered among themselves. "If even the engineers can't fix it," one said, "then maybe it's impossible." Samuel tightened his grip on his broom. His chest felt heavy, as if his heart was urging him to step forward. But still, he stayed silent. Then, something happened. One of the engineers, in his frustration, dropped a set of tools. They scattered across the floor, rolling near Samuel's feet. Samuel bent down and picked them up. As he handed them back, his eyes briefly fell on the control panel. Without thinking, he muttered softly, "The lower switch is not aligned." The engineer froze. "What did you say?" Samuel quickly shook his head. "Nothing. Just, nothing." But the words had already spread. A few nearby engineers looked at him curiously. For the first time in 4 days, they noticed the janitor. The manager frowned. "You. What did you say?" Samuel stood still, his broom in one hand, the tools in the other. His heart pounded. He wanted to remain silent, but something inside pushed him forward. He took a deep breath and spoke. "I said, the lower switch is not aligned properly. That's why the machine won't start." The hall fell into silence. 100 engineers turned to stare at the janitor. The workers leaned forward, their eyes wide. No one could believe it. The manager's eyes narrowed. "And how would you know that?" Samuel looked down at his rough hands. His voice was quiet but steady. "I've worked with machines all my life. Maybe not like this one, but I know how they speak. I can see what's wrong." Some engineers scoffed. "A janitor thinks he can fix what we cannot. Impossible." Others whispered among themselves, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. The manager's face hardened. "Do you mean to tell me," he said slowly, "that after 4 days of failure, a janitor believes he can succeed where 100 trained engineers could not?" Samuel met his eyes. For the first time, his voice carried strength. "I do not believe. I know. Give me 10 minutes. The room erupted in murmurs. The workers gasped. The engineers exchanged shocked looks. Some laughed nervously, others shook their heads. But the manager raised his hand, silencing them all. He stared at Samuel for a long moment. Then he said, "Fine. If you are so confident, show us. But if you fail, you will regret wasting my time." Samuel nodded slowly. He placed his broom aside, wiped his rough hands on his overalls, and walked toward the silent machine. For the first time in 4 days, all eyes in the hall followed him. The janitor who had been invisible, the man no one had cared to notice, was now standing before the mighty machine. The workers held their breath. The engineers folded their arms, some amused, some doubtful. The manager crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. Samuel placed his hand on the machine, feeling its cold metal. He closed his eyes for a moment, listening, as though the machine had a heartbeat only he could hear. Then, with calm hands, he bent down toward the lower switch. The hall was so silent that even the sound of his fingers turning the lever could be heard. And in that silence, a new story was about to begin. The factory hall had never been so silent. Every worker, every engineer, even the manager stood frozen as Samuel placed his rough hands on the machine. The man who had always been invisible now stood at the center, under the light, with all eyes fixed on him. For a moment, Samuel closed his eyes and breathed deeply. He was not afraid of the machine, he was afraid of the people around him. 100 engineers waiting to laugh. A manager waiting to scold. Workers waiting to see him fail. But deep inside, Samuel knew what he had seen. He knew what the machine was asking for. He whispered softly to himself, 10 minutes. That's all. Then he bent down and opened the lower panel. His hands moved with surprising confidence, as if he had touched the machine many times before. The engineers leaned forward, frowning. One whispered, "He doesn't even have gloves." Another said, "He'll break it." But Samuel ignored them. He studied the wires and found the one that had been wrongly connected. He carefully detached it and placed it in the correct socket. His hands were steady, guided not by books, but by years of experience fixing whatever came into his life. 5 minutes passed. Samuel adjusted screws, aligned the lever, and pressed a hidden reset button that the engineers had overlooked. He worked quietly, without a single wasted movement. The workers whispered among themselves. "Look at him, he knows what he's doing." Even the engineers stopped mocking and started watching closely. Some of them took notes without realizing it, their pride mixing with curiosity. At the 9th minute, Samuel stood up and wiped his hands on his overalls. He looked at the manager and said calmly, "It's ready now. Press the button." The manager raised an eyebrow. "Already?" Samuel nodded. "Yes. The machine was never broken. It was only waiting for the right connection." The manager hesitated, then motioned to one of the engineers. "Press it." The engineer walked forward, his hand trembling as it hovered over the start button. The hall grew so silent that even the hum of the factory lights could be heard. With a deep breath, the engineer pressed the button. For a moment, nothing happened. A second of silence stretched like an eternity. The workers held their breath. The engineers shook their heads. Some began to whisper, "It failed." But then a low hum rose from the machine. Lights flickered across its surface. Gears began to turn. Panels lit up with steady colors. The silent giant that had refused to move for 4 long days suddenly came alive. The workers gasped. Some covered their mouths in shock. The engineers froze, their eyes wide, unable to believe what they were seeing. The manager stepped forward, his stern face softening as the machine roared to life. Within seconds, the machine was running smoothly, its belts moving, its arms shifting with perfect precision. The sound filled the hall, not as noise, but as music, the music of success. Samuel stepped back quietly, his face calm. He did not raise his arms in pride or shout for attention. He simply stood with his broom by his side, as if he had done nothing extraordinary. But for everyone else, it was a miracle. The workers erupted in cheers. Their voices echoed through the hall, carrying relief and joy. "It's working! It's working!" The engineers stood frozen in disbelief. Some dropped their notebooks. Others rubbed their eyes, as though trying to wake from a dream. One whispered, 4 days, and he did it in 10 minutes. The manager walked slowly towards Samuel. His steps were heavy, but his eyes were filled with something new: respect. He stopped in front of the janitor and asked quietly, "How did you know?" Samuel looked at the running machine, then at the manager. His voice was humble. "Machines speak. You just have to listen." The hall fell silent again at those words. They were simple, yet they carried a weight heavier than all the manuals and diagrams the engineers had studied. The manager nodded slowly. He looked at the engineers, then back at Samuel. For the first time, he saw not a janitor, but a man who carried knowledge no degree could measure. The workers clapped louder, their voices rising in waves. The engineers, though silent, could not hide their shame. 100 trained minds had failed, yet the man they never noticed had succeeded. Samuel picked up his broom again, as though nothing had changed. But everything had changed. The invisible man had stepped into the light, and the whole factory had witnessed it. As the machine continued to run, stronger than ever, the workers' faces filled with hope. The factory's future was safe, thanks to the man who had been overlooked for years. That evening, as the sun set outside and the machine kept humming, Samuel quietly left the hall. He did not wait for praise, nor did he demand recognition. He walked with the same calm steps, his broom on his shoulder, his heart at peace. For him, fixing the machine was not about proving himself to the engineers or the manager. It was about answering the call of something he understood deeply. But for everyone else, those 10 minutes had changed everything. The story of the janitor who repaired the foreign machine in 10 minutes would spread far beyond the walls of that factory. And it was only the beginning. The sound of the running machine echoed through the factory like thunder. For 4 long days, the hall had known only silence and failure. Now the giant moved with perfect rhythm, its belts turning, its arms shifting, its lights glowing steadily. It was alive, and every person in the hall stood frozen, unable to look away. The workers were the first to react. They clapped and shouted, their voices breaking the silence. "It's working! It's working!" Tears of relief filled their eyes. For them, the machine meant security, jobs, and a future. After days of doubt, their hope had returned. The engineers, however, could not cheer. They stood stiff, staring at the janitor who had done in 10 minutes what they could not achieve in 4 days. Some lowered their heads in shame, their pride crushed. Others whispered among themselves, their voices filled with disbelief. How did he do that?" one muttered. Another shook his head. "We tried everything. How could he see what we missed?" The manager walked slowly across the floor, his eyes fixed on Samuel. His usual stern face had softened, but behind it lay something even heavier: realization. He stopped in front of Samuel, who stood quietly with his broom, as if nothing extraordinary had happened. "Tell me," the manager said, his voice low but firm, "how did you know what to do?" Samuel looked at the machine, still humming with life, and then back at the manager. His answer was simple. "Machines talk, sir. They don't use words, but they speak through their design. If you listen carefully, you can hear what they need." The words spread across the hall like a wave. The workers listened with awe. The engineers exchanged uneasy glances. They had spent years in schools and training centers, memorizing diagrams and formulas. Yet this man, with no degree, had shown them something greater: understanding. The manager studied Samuel for a long time. At last, he nodded slowly. "You have done what 100 engineers could not. You have saved us." Samuel lowered his eyes. His voice was humble. "I only did what I could. Nothing more." The humility in his words struck the hearts of everyone present. He did not boast, did not demand recognition, did not even raise his head proudly. He simply stood with the same broom he had carried for years, as if still only the janitor. The workers clapped again, louder this time, their cheers echoing through the factory. But the engineers remained silent. Their hearts were heavy, not only with shame but with respect. They had dismissed Samuel as invisible, unworthy of attention. Now they realized the truth: they had been blind to the wisdom standing beside them all along. One young engineer, unable to hold back, stepped forward. His voice trembled as he spoke. I. I'm sorry. We never listened. We thought you were just the janitor. But today you taught us more than all our manuals combined. Samuel looked at him gently and shook his head. You don't need to say sorry. Sometimes the world looks at a person's uniform, not their heart. That's the way it is. The young engineer lowered his eyes, ashamed. The manager turned to the rest of the engineers. Remember this day. Knowledge is not only in books or certificates. True knowledge lives in the eyes of those who observe, and in the hands of those who practice. Never forget that. The hall fell silent again, but this time the silence was not heavy with failure, it was filled with thought. The engineers had learned a lesson that no classroom had ever taught them. Samuel quietly picked up his broom again. The workers watched in disbelief. Why are you still cleaning? One asked. You should be celebrated. You should be honored. Samuel smiled softly. This is my duty. Machines are my love, but this is my work. I will not abandon it. Those words touched everyone deeply. A man who could fix a machine worth millions in 10 minutes chose still to sweep the floor with dignity. He asked for nothing, demanded nothing, and yet gave everything. By evening, the story of the miracle had already begun to spread. Workers whispered to each other as they left the factory. Did you see? The janitor fixed it? In 10 minutes. It's true, another replied. 100 engineers failed, but he succeeded. People will talk about this for years. And they were right. What happened in that factory was not just about a machine coming to life. It was about pride being broken, respect being rebuilt, and truth being revealed. That night, as the engineers sat in their homes, they thought about Samuel's words. Many of them felt ashamed, but also inspired. They realized they had to learn not only from books, but also from people like Samuel, people who understood the language of machines without needing manuals. The manager, too, sat in his office long after the factory lights went dark. He replayed the moment again and again, the janitor stepping forward, fixing the machine, and speaking with such calm wisdom. For the first time, the manager asked himself a hard question: how many other Samuels have been ignored in this world? And in his small room, Samuel sat by the window with his old notebook of sketches. The machine's sound still rang in his ears, not as pride, but as peace. He whispered softly, today, they listened. That is enough. The night sky stretched above him, filled with stars. And Samuel, the man no one had noticed for years, had become the light everyone could see. The next morning, the factory was filled with a different kind of energy. The machine hummed smoothly in the center of the hall, no longer a source of frustration but of pride. Workers moved confidently around it, checking operations and helping one another. A sense of hope and possibility hung in the air. Samuel, the janitor, entered quietly as usual, carrying his broom. But this time, the glances he received were different. The workers nodded at him with respect. Even some of the engineers, though still humbled, offered small smiles. He felt their acknowledgement, but he said nothing. His calm, quiet presence had always been part of him, and he preferred it that way. The factory manager, however, had called for a meeting. All engineers, supervisors, and key workers were asked to gather in the hall. Samuel stood slightly to the side, unsure if he should step forward. The manager cleared his throat and began. Yesterday, we witnessed something remarkable. A machine that defeated 100 engineers was brought to life in 10 minutes. This is not just about skill, it is about understanding, patience, and attention. The person responsible is standing here among us. Heads turned, and eyes widened. Some engineers could hardly believe what they were hearing. Samuel stepped forward slowly, still holding his broom, his expression calm. The manager continued, Samuel, your work has reminded us of an important lesson: true talent and wisdom do not always come with titles or certificates. You have shown courage, humility, and intelligence. For that, we are grateful." The hall fell silent for a moment, then erupted into applause. The workers cheered loudly, clapping Samuel on the back and shaking his hand. Even the engineers, though humbled, joined in. They had learned that day that knowledge is not measured by degrees alone, but also by observation, experience, and a willingness to act. Samuel smiled quietly, not out of pride, but from a deep sense of peace. He had never sought recognition, yet seeing the gratitude in the eyes of the people around him was rewarding beyond words. One young engineer stepped forward. "Samuel," he said, his voice a mix of respect and awe, "I've studied machines for years, yet I learned more from you in 10 minutes than I did in all my training. I am truly sorry for doubting you." Samuel nodded kindly. "It's okay. Mistakes happen when we judge too quickly. The important thing is that we learn." The manager then addressed everyone. "From today, Samuel will not only be our janitor but also our consultant for complex machines. His experience and insight are invaluable. We must remember that talent can come from the most unexpected places." The announcement sent waves of surprise through the hall. Samuel, ever humble, simply nodded. He did not boast or demand attention. He knew that his work, not his title, defined him. The workers gathered around him, asking questions, seeking guidance, and sharing their own experiences. Samuel answered patiently, showing them small ways to improve efficiency and prevent errors. His quiet knowledge spread like fire, inspiring others to observe and think carefully rather than rush through tasks. The engineers, humbled but motivated, began to see Samuel as a teacher. They learned to combine their formal knowledge with practical observation, realizing that collaboration and listening were just as important as technical skills. Days passed, and the factory ran better than ever. The machine, once a source of fear and doubt, became a symbol of possibility. Every time it hummed and moved, people remembered the moment it had been brought to life, not by 100 engineers, but by one man who had been overlooked. Samuel continued his daily routine, sweeping the floors and quietly observing the machines. But now, people stopped to greet him. They asked for advice, sought his guidance, and treated him with respect. He had changed the minds of those around him without ever demanding recognition. The story of Samuel, the janitor who repaired the foreign machine in 10 minutes, spread beyond the factory walls. Directors in other companies, engineers in faraway towns, and even local newspapers carried the tale. People admired the lesson it taught, that talent, humility, and understanding are sometimes hidden in places no one expects. One evening, as Samuel cleaned near the humming machine, a young worker approached him. "Samuel," she said softly, "thank you. You taught me that no matter who you are, your work and knowledge matter. I'll never forget this." Samuel smiled gently, his eyes reflecting the warm light of the factory. "Remember," he said, "never stop observing. Never stop learning. And never judge someone by the uniform they wear. Everyone has something valuable to give." The young worker nodded, inspired. Around them, the factory hummed with energy and pride. Samuel returned to his sweeping, quietly content. He had not sought glory, but in his quiet way, he had changed the lives of everyone around him. The factory would continue to thrive, the workers would continue to hope, and the engineers would remember a lesson that no manual could ever teach, that the greatest knowledge sometimes comes from the most unexpected hands. And Samuel, the janitor who had once been invisible, had become the heart of the factory, a symbol of humility, talent, and quiet wisdom that would be remembered for years to come.